Father, I ask that you would take these words of mine, and Lord, the ones that are of you, I ask that you would plant and water and flourish. And those that aren't, Lord, I ask that they would fall to the ground and die. Lord, we want to hear you. We look for your word. Amen. On Thursday, I went out on the streets with David, and we prayed with people. And I confess, I went and said to the Lord, "Okay, I'm going because David's asked me." But if there's a divine appointment here, I look for it. And Lord, I don't want to just be wasting my time. And so prayed with a number of people. One guy, he got an ingrowing toenail, which might not sound much, but was very, very painful for this man. And I prayed with him, and I asked them to ring me the next day to let me know whether they were pain-free or not, and they rang on Friday to say that they are pain-free. So that was really encouraging. And what was also encouraging was the fact that he's a Christian who goes to church in Road, and I said to him, well, make sure you tell everybody what God has done for you. Encourage the church. Let's build the church up. So that was really exciting. One of the other things that I discovered was I had conversations with two women, actually, who were both talking about the unease they have over Europe and the whole referendum and how it's causing such uncertainty into the whole of the nation and actually in the whole of Europe. It's not just us, it's the whole of Europe is looking and watching to see what we're going to do. And that there is that real unsettled, people are unsettled and they just want things to go back to normal. And I was thinking, what is the right decision? We so desperately want a right decision. And of course there are Christians on both sides, just as there are on any election. There are Christians on both sides because we see the world differently. And God gives us freedom to choose how we solve our problems. And so how do we know? How do we know whether we remain or we exit? What is God saying, in or out? So let's have a look at Isaiah chapter 10. Got several verses from Isaiah today, so let's... So verses 1 and 2, and it says this: Woe to those who make unjust laws, to those who issue oppressive decrees, to deprive the poor of their rights and withhold justice from the oppressed of my people, making widows their prey and robbing the fatherless. And he goes on to tell them what disaster is going to come. So what does the Father condemn? When we're looking at these verses, what is he condemning? The woe means, bad stuff's happening. It's not good. Father's condemning it. So in these verses then, our Father condemns unjust laws, oppressive decrees, depriving poor of their rights, withholding justice, not caring for widows and orphans. Now, I've just chosen these two verses, but I could have chosen from hundreds of others, which all say the same sort of thing, that God hates it when the weak, vulnerable and marginalised are ignored, neglected and abused. What he wants is for them to be protected. And if we look in in Micah chapter 6 and verse 8, it's a very, very famous verses, and lots of people quote these often. Very often they're in a church's mission statement as well, and it says, God has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. So really, that these things should help us make our decision. That what we want is we want justice and mercy and for people to be walking humbly with God. But how does that help us in making our decision? Because again, Christians on both sides will will argue for this, both to remain and to leave, and that both remaining and leaving will help the vulnerable in our society, not only here but across Europe, and that they'll be better off under their particular decision, leave or remain. So I confess, even at this stage, I have no clear way which to vote. And I'm going to ask you, please don't tell me how to vote. Okay, I don't want you to do that. If you want me to tell you how you're going to vote, I'll listen, provided you've reached your decision motivated by love and care of the poor and how the gospel can be spread. So in other words, we need to be making our decision based on God's guidance. And I appreciate that this could be either way, either remain or leave. We will hear God differently. But what I'm asking is that you examine the reasons for your vote. So if your vote is based on any of these, hatred of people who are different than us, hatred of systems which we don't like, fear of change, either because our nation's already changed too much, or fear of the unknown, so, both of those fear motivates. We don't want to be motivated by fear, or any other soulish, selfish reason. In other words, this decision is good for me because X, Y, Z, then that's not the way to be voting. We need to be voting with God's love and concern top of the list. So my plea to you as your pastor, and I don't think I've ever asked you as a pastor before, use that weight, if you like, of my title behind me. My plea to you as your pastor is this: whichever way you vote, be motivated by love and the long-term concern for the weak, the vulnerable, and the powerless, and how the gospel will be spread. And again, people will argue both ways. If we stay in, we have freedom to go and speak the gospel wherever we like because we can travel freely, or we vote out and we can do whatever it is we're going to do. Okay, so, both ways I've heard argued. But I ask that you will keep this in mind then. You're motivated by love and the long-term concern for the weak, vulnerable and powerless, that you're motivated by how the gospel can be spread, and that you keep in prayer for his will to be done. Because ultimately, whatever the result, our kingdom's mission doesn't change. We live in this world, but have a greater king who has a kingdom that isn't bound by geographical boundaries or political systems. Our king speaks of this vision for his ruler. So turn the page over to Isaiah chapter 11, verses 1 to 5. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots, a branch will bear fruit. And we know that this is talking about Jesus. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of power, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord. And he will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes, or decide by what he hears with his ears. But with righteousness he will judge the needy. With justice he will give decisions for the poor of the earth. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. Righteousness will be his belt, and faithfulness the sash around his waist. When he says he will judge the needy, it means he will judge on behalf of the needy. That's we'll make sure that the needy get justice. That's really what we're looking for, and righteousness there. So this is our king, the one we follow. This is his vision, if you like, of what our ruler will be like. And then come these very strange verses in Isaiah. And this is actually like one of the mission statements for the kingdom that God wants to see established. The wolf will live with the lamb, and the leopard will lie down with the goat, the calf and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child will lead them. The cow will feed with the bear, their young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox. The infant will play near the hole of the cobra, and the young child put his hand into the viper's nest. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the seas. Now, unfortunately, because I'm a bit slow-witted, I've only ever read this as being absolutely literal. That somehow in the future, in this utopian place when Jesus returns, all animals become vegetarians. And I've always thought there must be something more to these verses that I'm missing. And there's no reason to think ultimately this won't happen, because if everybody was, all the animals were on the ark, they must have been vegetarians. But, I've struggled with these verses, and finally the penny has dropped, you'll be glad to know. And it's poetry, and poetry uses symbolism. And I was never very good at understanding poetry at school. Anybody here good at poetry? Understanding poetry? Oh, you're all shaking your heads like me. Good. So I've come a bit late to this party of the real meaning and depth of these verses, okay? So my first question really is, how do I know it's poetry? All right, so you asking me that question. How do you know it's poetry, Jenny? You asking me that question? The NIV is very useful because when it's poetry, it very usefully writes with these little indentations, so it's set out differently. When it's just prose, ordinary writing and talking, it's set out in paragraphs, but when it's poetry, it's written in with these little verses and indentations, okay? So that the translators for the NIV really are very helpful towards us and help us in that. Now, there's all sorts of different writings in the Bible, and poetry is just one form, but Hebrew poetry has a particular way that it's written. And with Hebrew poetry, the symbolism normally builds twice. So in Psalms, if you ever read Psalms, which I know you do, very often they just the symbolism builds up. So you always have them in pairs or couplets, if you remember your poetry from school. They come up in pairs. And normally it is only in pairs. So you make your point and you make your point again. Okay, so it's emphasized what God is doing. But in this bit here, what is so astounding is that the symbolism builds and builds and builds over these verses, and it's over and over and over until we end up with 9 word pictures of how God sees his rule on earth. So bear with me, okay? Isaiah chapter 11, here we are in these verses, verses 6 to 8. And we see these contrasts, if you like, of the strong and the weak, 9 separate times. So we've got the wolf with the lamb, the leopard with the goat, the calf with the lion, and the child's going to, the little innocent toddler is going to lead them all. We've got the cow and the bear, and the young are going to, the cow and the bear, young cubs are going to, cub and calf are going to lie down together. We've got the lion and the ox, the infant playing with the cobra, and the young child putting its hands into the nest of vipers. So you can see all the strong predatory animals and the weak defenseless ones, yeah? And so we've got these 9 sets of unlikely pairings. So the people in that time lived in a rural environment. They knew how dangerous it was to put these 2 sets of animals together, because one will end up damaged, mauled, or eaten. It's not going to be a happy ending if you put those 2 together. All right? If you put the wolf and the lion together, the wolf and the lamb together, it's not going to be a pretty picture by the time you've finished. So what's God saying? Why these random verses here? Is God just telling us everybody's going to be vegetarian, it's all going to be okay? It's not what he's saying at all. He said, in his kingdom and under his rule, God is saying that powerful people will not prey on the weak. They will not hunt them down. They won't kill them, and they won't destroy them. Influential people, you're thinking about a leopard, a leopard has power, a lion has power, a bear has power. Influential people will not intimidate the vulnerable. They will not make them live in fear. They will not make the vulnerable always on the lookout for attack. Because if you can imagine being a goat or a lamb or a child, danger comes and you're aware of danger. So in the flocks are always, a bit on edge because they don't know what's going to attack them. Now that's how poor and vulnerable people in our society can feel, that they're under attack. And God is saying, no, in my society, under my rule, they will never experience that. They won't feel that. So the influential people will not exploit the weak. They won't make them harder and harder and longer hours for their own benefit, keeping all the wealth for themselves. They will not oppress the defenseless ones. Instead, in his kingdom and under his rule, the powerful, wealthy, and influential will provide warmth, shelter, and security. Do you see that in those verses? That's what's happening as they lie down together and they eat together. That warmth, shelter, and security are being provided. They protect the vulnerable. And the wealthy, the powerful, and influential will change their ways and habits so that they consume differently. They will share what they have with the poor, with the less able, and the defenseless. And this is God's vision. So how does that come about? How do we move from one thing which is predatory and scary to something that is loving and sharing? It comes when every heart is changed, when each person comes in repentance to the living God and has their life transformed into the image of Christ. It's what happens when the drug dealer and the drug addict both are set free by Christ. They can live in peace and security with one another. It happens when the ruthless moneymaker and the benefit fraudster both turn to Christ. They see life from another perspective and contribute to the well-being of each other and to society. It's what happens when the malicious gossiper and the mentally ill find freedom to be whole in the healing love of God. Our commission hasn't changed, and nor will it after the referendum. No matter the result, our commission stays the same. Our commission is to go and make disciples through our words, our deeds, and our characters. So let's not be like Moses in Exodus 4:13, who, having been given the job by God to lead the people out of captivity, along with a supernatural experience of seeing God in the burning bush and speaking to him, and then God showing signs of his power through throwing down his staff and it turning into a stake, and him picking it up and it became a staff again, or putting his hand inside his cloak and when he pulled it out was leprous, and God said to him, put it back again, and it came out whole. Moses' response was, oh Lord, please send someone else to do it. Let that not be our response. Our response should be, Lord, you have asked me to change the world one life at a time, to help you in making disciples. Lord, send me, send me. So let us recognize the fact that we're Christ's ambassadors, that we're sent by him into the world to bring a message of hope, a hope where we can